What's handle?
Charge.
What about silk for 40 yards more?
Excuse me?
What about silk for 40 yards more?
Last of Mohegans.
1902 after he
Silk. Oh, might be silk patches.
Yeah, silk patches. Is that any truth
It's
to
a
that?
movie illusion.
Okay. A movie illusion. He was asking about silk patches. I think they melt. More or less. It's proteinaceous material and it doesn't hold up.
Mr. Rice, what are the variables for your barrels to make it shoot optimally at 100 yards? Say, what all the things you have to consider?
There's a tremendous amount of variables, and each barrel is a law unto itself. I can make two of them, one right after the other, and they will not shoot the same. Nothing changed technically, but they won't work. But in those variables, we're going to have to look at the quality of the bore, the diameter of the ball, the thickness of the patch, the quality of the lube, the quality of the powder, the granulation of the powder, the humidity. All of those things can affect. Now, to find that sweet spot, it's trial and error until you find what that barrel wants to eat. We have many calls on a guy who's wanting a swamp barrel for target work. And I say, the hell you say? Ain't going to get there from here. And or they'll ask me, well, what's the heaviest charge that you could use in that barrel? And I said, well, I see that in two questions there. Are you really trying to blow it up, or do you want to know what a common sense maximum charge? And a lot of folks today have a preconceived notion of what they want that barrel to do. And it's really not common sense. You've got to give that barrel what it wants. And you try to feed your girlfriend broccoli, if you don't like it, it's going to be bad. Well, of all the components that it takes for the barrel to discharge, you vary any of those, you can offset the other.
Does coning affect or not affect the way the gun shoots, coning the barrel?
What's the question, sir?
Coning a barrel.
Folks, I don't have practical experience there. I really can't address that. Now, in my literature, I tell folks that I've never shot barrels so modified, and I don't do that, that I will warranty the work I do, but if you do it after you buy the barrel, you own it. But I also tell them, bottom line, Joe Wood makes the tool. Shoot the barrel with the crown that comes on it, you get a baseline, and if the barrel don't work, now let's work right then. Let's take. But if you put the cone on it and it don't work, you've got a variable of two. Was the barrel really bad, or is the cone not straight in there? I really don't have a definitive answer because I have really no practical experience.
I think on the general overall rule that whatever configuration that muzzle is, if you load the same way every time, it's more or less going to repeat over the same thing, whether it's coned or not coned. I don't really like cones, and I don't think many early ones had it. It may be a phenomenon of the 19th century that's been imposed on earlier guns while they're still being used. I'd like to see that proven. If you do the traditional rifle barrel, you're boring from breech to muzzle, you get a choke bore. The wear on the stick gives you a choke bore. You can test that. It's very easy. It gives you a radical choke bore. Then you cut the rifling, and if you do what one of the Shenandoah Valley guys says you should do, is you put the saws back in there and make the lands hollowing. They put a tool in there to make the lands at a greater radius than it was bored. And we've made some of those to Williamsburg Gun Shop. And the advantage there is all the lines are going the same direction. There's no perpendicular lines there. And with the choke bore and the hollow lands, that thing loads real easy. You pop it at the muzzle with the ram, it's a regular ramrod, and it goes right on down. Now, of course, fouling and subsequent shots change all that. It does in every barrel. The loading changes as you get more fouling in it. But I don't think if a barrel was done that way, that a coned muzzle does anything but labor the loading. If that makes sense.
Well, I've had two barrels come into the shop with brand X makers, and they were coned, and you couldn't hit a bull in the proverbial barn of the thing. And they requested, barrels be replaced. And of course the guns went to working to their satisfaction. But I said, now if you'll take that barrel and cut it off, and they let us do that, and put a standard crown on it, the chances are it's the cone, not the barrel. Those two barrels that psychologically would not work. And psychology is a big thing. And if you've got confidence, you can do a job. If you don't have the confidence, you're out of luck already. But we cut those cones off, re-crowned them, and those barrels work.
If your cone is rough enough or there's something about it that's, say, cutting the patch,
Exactly.
then
Or
you're not going to get the, that throws everything
all right,
out.
if you look at the crown on a varmint rifle, it may be rebated so that you can't, bang and ding the crown over. But the crown in there is just totally square cut. It's 90 degrees. Those barrels will shoot well until you damage that cone. If that cone on a modern gun, or if the crown on that modern gun is not 90 degrees to that bore, the gas is applying pressure on one side at a faster rate than it is on the off side. Same with a cone. If you don't have a pilot that's going to guide the cutter, or if the cutter can even chatter and give you some trouble, but it has to be faced 90 degrees to have an even chance of cutting concentric. I do believe that a cone will work fine if the barrel were 90 and if it had a pilot, assuming that barrel has propensity to shoot with a cone. Again, it's an individual.
I'm going to have to leave, but I want to leave with this. Most rifles are better than people shooting them, despite all these variables. Very few people are good enough to find the fault in most rifles. I mean, an average rifle, old or new, if it's properly operated, if the shooter is more at fault typically, and every once in a while you've got one that's got a problem. But
what's your diagnosis on a burning patch? In other words, your shooter shot and the patch goes
Thanks,
out.
Wallace.
Thank you.
The patch goes out at 15 yards and it's smoking and flaming.
Okay. All right, the question is, how about burning patches? What contributes to a burning patch? Well, if the patch is damaged during loading, i.e., it's going to cut a patch and it already has the hole in it, the gas cutting is going to be a problem. If we assume that the crown and the smoothness of the bore is such that it did not cut the patch, and yet the patch is destroyed, then the material, the age of the material, the lubrication, how much powder, there's just a great number of variables that can control that. But if it's not being cut, in the loading process, then generally it's a choice of components that will attribute to that. Now, yes, sir. I don't know any barrel maker that goes out of his way to make a barrel that won't shoot. All right, there's a whole lot of barrel makers out here, so which one's best? Is there a best? I guess you have to answer in your own mind, am I looking for a barrel at a price? Am I looking for one that's machined real finely? Those type of things. I've had a running debate with Earl Lanning, probably as knowledgeable human being that we have today in this field. And he's a very opinionated fellow, but he's fellows you got to honor because he knows what he's talking about. He's very learned. But a modern gun, let's say in the Chambers class, he said, well, that gun's plastic. It is so highly refined, he said, you wouldn't find an original gun executed as well as Chambers can now execute a gun. That's probably so. But when I take that conversation over to our barrels, and he uses our barrels now, but he says those barrels are too slick. Well, I asked him, I said, Earl, what is the definition of slick? That forced him to think the interior of a barrel. And of course, in shooting, you got interior ballistics and exterior ballistics. I said, well, Earl, the way I look at it, if you've got a barrel that is relatively rough, a target shooter immediately laps the barrel. Why did he do it? To make it slick. All right. Actually, we're just getting the continuity in there. But I think in our mindset, a slick barrel is a barrel that's shot out. The edges of the lands no longer grip the patch. So it forced him then to think, and he's much more learned than I am on hell of a lot of topics on guns. He said, well, maybe you're right. I said, well, if I have the ability to highly refine the bore of that, why should I not do that? Why should I make it rough if I could really make it slick? And he finally acceded to the fact that you should be highly refined, and that definition of slick is not shot out. So I finally swayed him over to our side on that. But he's a tough character.
I'd like to back up for just a second and talk about, make some comments about cone muzzles and stuff. I'm sorry Wallace isn't here, but
You wait.
that may make it easier.
You timed it just right.
No. Go ahead, pick on me if you want. I think a lot of what Wallace said is true, and I don't know of anybody who I have greater respect for in his ability as a gun maker or his experience in that. So when Wallace says something, I pay very close attention. But in my experience, I've done a lot of coned muzzles over 25 years, something like that. I've been doing that since I worked with John Bivens back in 1978. John is the first one I know of who did that back then. And he found when he first started that his accuracy was every bit as good as it was with a standard crown. And he started doing that because of evidence he saw in original guns. You know, so I mean, there's always room for being uncertain about what was happening. And in my own experiments with it, I found that my barrels shoot as well. The ones I cone shoot just fine, and I don't see any problem with it. Now, recently, I've experimented some with ball size, patch sizes, and I think that has a lot to do with how easy or hard it is to load a gun, and the type of patching that was used in the 18th century, their expectations of how tight a ball had to be. So I think if you're gonna try to get the type of patch and ball combination that many target shooters use today, that's not what they were doing. And so you could fairly easily load a gun without a cone in it without a problem. Okay? So I think you can do it either way. But personally, I haven't found cones to be a problem to accuracy. And I rather like them. Now, I come from, 25, 30 years of experience with that and don't see a problem with it. But it's like LC says here, it's got to be done with a pilot, it's got to be done with a lot of care, and it's not something you just jump right into and file in there. So,
How deep do you make your cone?
just to the depth of the rifling, and I think, well, as far as depth, how long, I think a fairly long one is good. Now, Joe Wood's coning tool is the one I have experience with, plus some of the ones that Getz turned in the bore. Early on, Getz just turned them in the bore. See, and those were turned on a lathe and concentric and everything. See, and that's a very important thing. That makes a big difference. But you can do a very good job with Joe Wood's coning tool, and it does help loading a tight patch, getting that ball started easily. But it doesn't make all the difference. If you use a reasonable ball and patch combination, you can start it easily in the muzzle without a short starter. I don't see any point in using a short starter, no matter which way you're going. If we're talking about sporting rifles, okay, that's the big difference, I think. When your research on original guns, and what I have heard throughout the industry, that early guns had radius bottom rifles. If a square bottom cutter is easier to make, why in the early days did they do that? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Don't know that, and I'm not. I don't know either. Yeah, there's so few original. One problem is there are so few original bores left in American long rifles. If you're lucky, you see a little bit at the muzzle, maybe. And we don't even know how original that is. I mean, how many times it's been recut by how many different people. I think that's certainly true. Well, Wallace was talking a moment ago about when you make a barrel, you're going to drill from breech to muzzle. Even today, most of us will drill from the breech to muzzle, ream, Now we're talking about modern tools, not long reamers, whatever. So we'll drill from the breech to the muzzle, but we'll ream from the muzzle to the breech. And if you go to a gun show and you're even looking at a modern gun, or you pick a gun barrel up, we're looking basically either into artificial light or you're looking at natural light. You're really not seeing the hole. You're seeing light refractions bouncing around. You go to a gun show and pick up a 270, damn, that's a pretty thing. And the throat's shot out. You couldn't see the throat. Same with one of these barrels. When we're rifling, of course, we got a computerized rifling machine, and one can tickle those little plastic buttons and get any helical in there that you want. You still have to hand grind. Well, actually, you'll use fixtures, of course, but technically you hand grind the cutter. Well, if one takes a square cutter, and the bore at that point it's really not square because you're dealing with the radius of the hole, that's there, but we refer to it as square. That cutter is easy to make, easy to sharpen, and longevity is good. And we'll normally take the rifling down 10 to 12 thousandths. If one looks at a round bottom rifling, because it's a U, if you will, you can only get the full width of the groove by going a certain depth of the cutter. So if we were going to have equal dimensions in either a square or a radius, you would have to take the radius 16 to 18 thousandths. Now on this computerized machine, it's a countdown program. And let's say we enter a factor that it's going to count 860 strokes. All right? And we're going to cut 7. And we're going to cut only 2 10,000ths at a pass. Well, I can cut a square bottom rifle barrel in about 28 to 32 minutes based on caliber and how much metal we're moving on the wheel. It takes slightly over an hour on that same machine to cut a round bottom rifle. So then the question comes up, which is the more accurate? Unknown. So we have employed Fred Stutzenberger at Clemson University and supplied him 250 caliber barrels, round heavy bull blanks, one with square, one with round. And he's going to put those on an understriker with a scope and run scientific tests looking for groups. When folks ask me today at the booth, what do you recommend, square or round? The only definitive answer that I can give, because I really don't know, and I'll tell them I don't know, because each barrel's an individual. I said, if you go look at all the stores fired at friendship, none are fired with round bottom rifle. And then you have to break that down in your mind. Most of the barrel makers refuse to make round bottom rifling, so that wasn't available to him anyway. And then there's a bias against round bottom rifling in a target barrel. So we've employed Stutzenberger to run a definitive test to see can a round keep up with a square. The verdict's out. Of course, they're just now in trials on that. So hopefully you'll see a definitive article.
What kind of variables will he try to control in his test? Do you know?
Well, we've agreed that he will have to find the sweet spot on the barrel. Again, being an individual, even though they're both 50s, both will have the same width grooves, cut with the same reamer and with the same burnisher through the barrel. He will have to find the sweet spot. So let's assume that the square bottom will shoot at 80 grains, 18 thousandths patch, and whatever lubricant he's using. And the same combination will be used in that radius bottom, except the variable will be where did it get its best accuracy. Because if you run straight across the board, let's say at 50, one may outweigh the other, or both may not even shoot. So he's got to find that spot, and even after that, it'll be subjective, because there's just too many variables there to be definitive.
But you're only defending will be round or...
Yeah. Now, years ago, we had a barrel maker around this part of the world, Hoppy. And boy, was that boy a collie. But he had a shooter up here by the name of Mike Bell on his team. And Mike Bell set a lot of records that are still on the records here today. And he would make various style patterns of rifling cuts. And I have a number of his barrels still today. And if one takes an eye loop and looks at